everybody, it's Steve Elkenacre. Welcome to the Circle of Brilliance. Today we begin a new subject, and that is conflict. And we're going to be talking about, go back a slide, managing conflict and some multiple little topics to explore there, and then types of conflict and all sorts of things. And this conversation actually was suggested by Tim. And so, Tim, do you want to share a little bit about how this came to be a topic of interest to you?
Sure. Thanks, T. I have a client that, a nonprofit that has a board, and there has been conflict between the board and the group that they support primarily financially. And, it's spilling over from prior leadership. And so they've asked me to come in and facilitate some discussion with them between those two entities to try and get to the root of the conflict and help them get past it. So that's really where it comes from, and started doing some research and pulling some things together, and had a conversation with T about it during our weekly call. And just sort of thought it might be something you all might find interesting to see how it might plot out with regards to the change grid.
Yeah, and that got a lot of discussion going. In fact, I got some feedback from several of you about things you wanted to put out there to become part of the discussion. I just added one because I saw a little note here written about is there such a thing as change in the absence of conflict? And I thought that's a very interesting thing to spend some time on. So we'll talk about managing conflict, and you can see the topics here. We need to get a better understanding of what we really mean by conflict and the frame we put around conflict. This idea about conflict as a prerequisite for change. Conflict and harmony geolocation. Where on the change grid does harmony live? Where does conflict live? Where are there blends of that? Conflict pairings. If we put conflict is almost always going to involve a minimum of two people. And there is one big exception to that, but nevertheless, two people. Well, where on the change grid are these two people relative to one another? So is conflict always involve two people in two different places, or can two people in the same general area of the change grid still find themselves in conflict? So we're going to talk a little bit about conflict pairings. Then ultimately we need to get around to how do we go about resolving conflict, because obviously, as interesting as those first four suggested subjects may be, we're in the business of helping people to perform more effectively, live their life more fully, all those wonderful transformative and developmental sorts of things. So we got to resolve the conflict. That's the work that we'd probably be engaged to do. And then if we're able to resolve the conflict, would it be nice to build some groundwork, set a foundation in place where people could move forward living more in harmony than in conflict with one another? So that's some of the subjects. If you guys have another one you want to throw on the pile, there's a room for at least two more without me having to reduce my font size. So you feel free to suggest whatever you'd like to suggest.
What about intensity?
Intensity of conflict. Let's put that somewhere.
I'm looking at a survey or a study right now because when Tim mentioned it, I wanted to do some research and just see what's out there. And this research from Florida International University talks about.
Yeah, Brian, you're disappearing. Come back to the microphone. Follow the light.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, much better.
Yeah. Okay. So it talked about its title is All Conflict the Same, and it says here it's looking at the role that conflict intensity plays in amplifying the individual's affective reactions to it.
Oh, okay.
So it's talking about the relationship between interpersonal conflict and perceived stress, physical symptoms, job satisfaction through negative.
Yeah, that'll touch upon something else that Tim and I were chatting about. And we were talking about what happens when you look at the 5 levels of tension combined with the layer of the change grid that talks about intensity. And I think that as we start to look about where conflict lives on the change grid, we can also take a look at those intensity rings and see how is that explaining the magnitude of that intensity. Peter, your hand is up.
Yep.
You're always welcome to
Yes.
just chime in.
Okay.
So you feel
Super. I
free.
didn't want to interrupt anybody, but
No,
I
feel
was
free.
thinking, you know, well, I was thinking conflict between the personality types, like the driver and those that are more relationship oriented. They tend to trigger each other and thus have a much greater difficulty aligning.
Indeed. In fact, one of the little slides I've pulled out for conflict pairings is looking specifically about personality types in conflict with one another, because I think that's a lot of it, because those personality types obviously have varying values associated with them, you know, different perspectives on the world and their role in that world and all those sorts of things. I mean, a lot of that travels with personality, so it's got to be part of it.
Yes.
Yep. All right. And so now what Tim and I were first kind of bouncing around was the different types of conflict. And I'll give you a little fun thing when we get into it, but I just wanted to throw this one slide up because this seems to be the one that is perhaps most useful, even though it's the most general. And so this, whoever put this together, I never, you know, you find a lot of these things and you can't find any citation or any reference about where this originated. So if anyone knows, that's great. I'll be happy to add it to the slide. But they said the types of conflict are, number one, interpersonal. So two people have some issue between them. This next one I thought was super interesting because if anything, the people who work as coaches probably deal with intrapersonal conflict more so than any of the others, because this is the conflicts that rage inside of the individual. So I think that's a very, you know, big category of conflict that does not necessarily involve another person, although it can certainly spill into relationships or interactions with other people. Because when you go to any kind of a place where other people will be, you bring you with you. And so if you're having all kinds of interpersonal conflict, it would not be surprising to have some of that spill into whatever else is going on. And then the other two are intragroup. I think we deal with a lot of that in our role as consultants, because this is group members that are in conflict with one another. And then intergroup is where there are varying groups that are in conflict with one another. And we see that play out at, you know, cultural levels, societal levels, you know, family levels, all sorts of things. So those are their four general types of conflict. And I found this to be very approachable. While it's general, it does seem to create four very functional buckets where you can put in all the rest of the kinds of conflict. So now Tim suggested a certain set of conflicts. Tim, do you remember what those were? You said, I think there were three that you brought.
Yeah. So structural, actually there's four. There's structural conflict, personal conflict, political conflict, and symbolic conflict.
Tell us a little bit about those.
So the structural conflict, which obviously relates to this nonprofit client, has to do with alignment and reporting relationships and responsibilities. The personal conflict is really reflective in the types of conflict that you have there, T, on the screen. And then political conflict has to do not with political parties, but has to do with the allocation of resources.
Oh, okay.
And then the symbolic conflict is pretty much that, as it says. Example of that could be something like the flag. And the grid that I pulled those four from says that symbolic conflict happens the least amount of time, but has the greatest impact. You know,
and so this is based on like triggers that certain visuals represent to various people.
Yes.
So it could be a flag, it could be any kind of some sort of an observable, whether it's a design or a gesture or whatever.
Exactly.
Okay,
and so the one that had the greatest amount of frequency was the structural conflict.
Interesting.
Yeah, but least amount of impact relative to symbolic.
Interesting. Yeah, because I was reading a little bit about symbolic conflict, and just for everyone's benefit, while it does involve things, pardon me, symbols that represent movements or causes or groups or whatever the case may be, it also said that it includes things like rolling your eyes. So if you're in a conversation with someone and they roll their eyes, that symbol ends up being highly triggering in some conflict kinds of situations. So I thought it was interesting what the concept of symbols actually includes. Yeah.
And the
Okay.
rolling of the eyes, T, is that subtle behavior that we talk about when we talk about micro messaging.
Mm-hmm. Yep. There's a lot of information in micro messaging. So they were talking about rolling the eyes, people, like if you're in a conflict in a boardroom kind of a setting or group kind of a setting, and you notice that something is said and two people who heard what was said suddenly look at each other with kind of like a knowing sort of a glance, that there is this, that represents something, that a camp has been formed, or there is an alliance or an allegiance or something or another. You're being judged and on and on. So it was just very interesting to know that these symbols don't necessarily have to be things that you can hang on the wall. It can really just be things that everyone is conveying in nonverbal ways.
Sounds like these are like cultural dynamic kinds of things. Because, a lot of times organizations tend to not understand that your organizational culture is a living, breathing thing, right?
Yeah,
So
yep.
it's not always going to be expressed, tangibly. Some of those things are intangible.
Absolutely. Even talking about gestures, I'm sure, we've all studied or read something about how a simple hand gesture that means really nothing of any significance in one culture can be highly offensive in another culture. And so if you're going to be working in a multicultural kind of an environment, you have to develop some sort of awareness and sensitivity to those kinds of the kinds of anchors that people have established with those kinds of,
Hey, T, can I add one more element to
Sure.
this discussion on conflict?
Sure.
I think we should bring the element that you brought in earlier into this discussion, and that's the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Because, my wife yesterday was in an executive committee meeting in her law firm, and they spent literally 2 hours discussing whether or not they were going to make vaccines mandatory.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, at the very end of it, they have about 109 employees, and 93% are vaccinated. And at the end of it, my wife happened to mention that we're bending over backwards for 9%, while 93% have demonstrated commitment to the firm. Seems a little ridiculous.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of conflict going on right now in general around that topic.
That's right. Yeah. And in that specific situation you've described it, if that were a closed community, and obviously I know that it's not, these people all have family lives and all that, but if that was a closed community and 93% had been vaccinated, then they've got herd immunity pretty strongly going for them. So it does make you wonder. It's kind of like, what's the point of discussing all this? What's it all about? Yeah. So, yeah. Anyway, you're right. And it's not only just the vaccination piece, the mask piece, that's a symbol too.
Yep.
It's amazing what kind of meaning that seems to carry and how it becomes. In fact, I'll give you an example. For a while, masks were mandated in Arizona, and then those kind of softened a bit. And then all the stores said, as much as we'd like you to continue to wear a mask, we're not going to require our employees or our customers who are fully vaccinated from wearing a mask. Well, who knows who's fully vaccinated? So suddenly, you're in the store and there's virtually no masks anywhere. And now I think because of the Delta variant, they're starting to reappear because people are freely choosing to wear them. But now it makes you kind of go like, what does my not wearing one communicate to people who have decided to wear one? Isn't that interesting? It's kind of like now I'm having a little bit of an intrapersonal conflict about the mask is sitting on my dashboard in the car. It's right next to me. So should I put it on? Shouldn't I put it on? What does it mean if I do? What does it mean if I don't? You know,
See,
it's
I
a
went to
very
the
real
store
thing.
this morning, and as I walked in, I looked around to see half the people were masked and half the people were not masked. So I didn't put mine on.
Yeah. And that's the thing, because it's like, all right, well, you know, I generally don't wear mine now either, because again, in Sun City West, I think the vaccination rate is well over 90%, because it's a high risk kind of age population across the board. So people have been vaccinated from early on. But nevertheless, you just kind of go, again, getting back to Tim's point about symbol, you just kind of go, what am I communicating if I do or do not do something? What are people communicating to me? Are they evaluating me based on the choice that I've made? You know, it's a very interesting sort of let's say trigger, I guess is the only word I can think
Well,
of.
it feels like the potential for conflict is under the surface all the time.
Yeah, right. And that's even at that interpersonal level. I mean, I hadn't verbalized this until I did with you guys, but all this conversation is happening in my own head. And so that's what I think that interpersonal conflict is really all about, you know, just you and your thoughts. Yep, Tim.
And can I add one
Oh,
thing?
Prater, yep, please
Yeah,
do.
so what I sometimes think about is the underlying stress that people have, the worry about so many things, and that we now are a lot more reactive. We have a shorter fuse, and that all of these are exacerbated by this underlying stress and mistrust that we have with each other and so many sources of information.
That's right. That's right. You know, and again, we all know this, that in the world of tension management, higher things that carry higher levels of tension get more attention. And if I'm in the world of media, I need that attention so that I get my revenue from advertising, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's almost an encouragement for a conflict to exist. It's like they need conflict. In the absence of conflict, is there anything noteworthy? Is there anything news to even report? You know, and so it's almost like, because they need it, to what degree are they either creating it, supporting it, stimulating it, you know, manipulating it is the worst part.
They're fomenting it.
Right.
They're actually creating it where if you just stuck to the rational facts, there's no conflict.
Yeah, that's why I love Edward Filene, who again, he was a very big believer in that you must follow the facts in a totally dispassionate way, because the facts will lead you to the truth. And I thought, well, that's really great. But we already talked about this. Unless people are in a certain area of the change grid, then their access to and appreciation of and respect for facts is just not really what it's all about. So got to be inside of that green circle. We'll talk about in a second or three. Now, this idea about types of conflict, I got to tell you, if you just do what I always love doing this as a starting point, I like to go to Google or whatever search engine you feel a particular affinity for. And I like typing in whatever. I typed in types of conflict and I clicked on images. And look at the variety of things that are available. And I like it. Oh no, there's 4 types of conflict. Oh no, there's 6 types of conflict. Here's 8 types of conflict. And then I thought this was particularly interesting. In the world of conflict in literature, they're talking about, if you want to learn how to write a good story, you need to know about the 6 or the 12 different kinds of story conflict. So that you can build whatever your narrative is around whatever that's going on. I thought, isn't that interesting? All these different types of conflict. So there are 6 main types of conflict, according to this one. Man versus man, man versus self, man versus nature, man versus society, man versus technology, and man versus time. So you kind of go like, well, a lot of that stuff is just that intrapersonal sort of stuff, isn't it? Where if it's me and my battle with nature, me and my battle with time, me and my battle, you know, last time I checked, technology wasn't knocking on my door, making things difficult. I mean, Yeah, anyway, there you are.
I mean,
Okay,
Pete,
so,
there's
yeah,
also there's also that conflict with self, within,
sure, right.
and where we may be struggling with our values and beliefs versus those facts and logical ways of looking at things, and struggling with trying to make a decision about moving in a particular direction or making a decision is
Yeah,
probably a better way to
yep,
say
yep,
it.
yep, yep. Um, I thought this was interesting. This one, they decided to add the supernatural. And as I read a little bit more, I clicked on that to see what they were talking about. That's people struggling with whatever their God concept happens to be. Or some people just believe that there are, like the universe already does things, has plans. Karma would be person versus supernatural. Sorts of things. I thought, okay, so the bottom line here is that there are so many different types of conflict and so many different people have put together whatever their, models happen to be, that I can't really use any of these. It might be interesting to take a moment and compile them all and see how many you end up with. But I thought, like, no, let's just say that there's a lot of conflict and it expresses itself in lots of different ways, and fine. But what's essential in what we learn about conflict, what we know about conflict? So hopefully we can explore that in a bit more detail. So bottom line, I decided I was going to abandon any attempt to decide there's X different types of conflict. I found these 4 categories were, as general as they are, useful enough to kind of get us to think about conflict from different ways. It is interesting to kind of go, where on the change grid, whenever you see 4 things, you kind of go, do these resonate with those quadrants? Yes, no, I don't really know, but we'll play with that. Now, all that being said, I did stumble across something I thought was very interesting. Didn't seem to have a lot of people giving competitive models to it, but that there were kind of phases in a conflict. And I thought from our work as consultants and coaches and various other types of human development professionals, this is probably something that's very useful for us
That is
to
useful.
understand. Yeah. Yeah. And so what are the phases? So I thought so let's work our way through these and see if it resonates with the work we're doing. So prelude to conflict, it involves all the factors which possibly arise a conflict among individuals. What country wrote this? Lack of coordination, differences in interests, dissimilarity in culture, religion, educational background are all instrumental in arising a conflict. Now, as I read more about what they meant by prelude to conflict, they said, what this is really all about is that there exist countless truths about people's lives and people's, groups and all that sort of stuff. They just are. And as long as all these differences exist, the potential for conflict is going to exist. And because there are cultural differences, religious differences, interests, etc., this is the prelude to conflict. There's all this variety around us. And so it's just like it's a conflict waiting to happen. So can we all kind of relate to this idea about a prelude to conflict? There's an environmental element to the whole thing.
Mhm.
Yep.
Yeah. Now, Tim, that might be, you were talking about political conflict is about who controls resources.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I wonder if that's it, because that would mean that inside of any kind of a group, there is a hierarchy. And that hierarchy includes the power to control resources, resource allocation, etc. That might be something that, as long as that concept exists, there is the potential for a conflict to arise.
And an example of that was when I was doing some work with a couple of the power companies in particular. And, as that industry is shifting towards cleaner energy. So there's this big conflict, if you will, between the fossil fuel plants and the nuclear power plants around budget allocation.
Sure.
And so those at the fossil plants were angry and upset with the organization because they felt that they were being neglected If you let them tell their story, they say, we started this business, you know, it all began with us, and now we're being pushed to the side, and
Mhm.
nuclear is getting the lion's share of the budget. And you go over to the nuclear plant and bring that up, and they'll say, yep, that's true.
Yeah, that's an absolutely huge conflict here in Arizona, because there's one camp, I happen to belong to this camp. I don't understand why we aren't just doing 100%. There's no place in the country that gets more sunshine than we get. And so we could produce so much solar power that we could offset some of the troubles that neighboring states have that don't have the amount of sunshine we have. Nevertheless, there's all this devotion to fossil fuels.
Yeah.
And you just go, and a hydro, and it's kind of like, yeah, and we're in a drought. How good is that? So, but guess what? The sun is still shining, and the vast majority of households don't have any kind of solar. And if you guys don't have solar power, I'll just quickly say to you that when your solar panels are doing their thing, your house does not run off of the solar panels. The solar panels put energy out onto the grid. And then you are still using electricity like you would if you didn't have any solar panels. It just so happens that the power company pays you for every kilowatt hour of electricity your panels put out onto the grid. So it seems like it offsets itself, but you'd have to have a whole house battery in order for your house to actually run off of your solar power. And that's a whole different investment that's currently cost prohibitive. But it's kind of like, well, then why don't you just why doesn't the power company just slap solar panels on top of everything? So I can completely understand this whole idea about conflict around how something is being done, why it's being done, you know, etc. So anyway, point is, Prelude to Conflict just acknowledges that there exists in life the way it is an abundance, I mean, an uncountable abundance of source material from which conflicts may arise. Now, the next one I thought was very interesting. No conflict can arise on its own. There's going to be some sort of a triggering event, subtle or profound. So there has to be an event which triggers the conflict. I have no idea who Jenny and Allie are, but I found this as part of a much larger kind of a narrative. So you can get along with very, very well. You're from different cultural backgrounds. Very strong factor for the possibility of conflict. Allie was in the midst of a presentation when Jenny stood up and criticized him for the lack of relevant content in his presentation, thus triggering the conflict between them. Well, yeah. So I get it. There's going to be something that will, set that spark, set that conflict underway. Now, the thing that they want to talk about in greater detail is this idea that while there are a lot of different triggering events that could happen, each of us at an individual level have got our own subset of triggers. And if we can better identify and understand what our triggers are for conflict, and we can better control those things from triggering us, the better we're going to be at, handling conflict, minimizing conflict, etc. At the same time, they said that it's a double-edged sword, because that could also mean that as you become more aware of what your triggers are, you also start to notice what other people's triggers are, and that equips you to deliberately trigger them if you wanted to. And forget triggering conflict that you might have with them, but if they know that party A is triggered by certain things that party B is doing, they can make A and B have a conflict with each other just because of their awareness of this idea about everyone having their own set of triggers. Thoughts about that?
I feel like you go back to the emotional intelligence that we were talking about in terms of the cornerstone being self-awareness. It's not enough to just have an emotion. You must understand how to regulate it or how to put it to its most appropriate use.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And a lot of this, it seems, in terms of these phases of conflict, it seems like conflict starts on a personal level because we have these deep beliefs that become key parts of behavior, and anything that goes against that could be a trigger.
Right.
Like I'm thinking, like even in medical school, the difference between a long white coat and a short white coat made a difference.
Oh yeah, because
Because
one of you're either the real deal or you're a student.
right, exactly. So one said, not only do I not have power, one said that my opinions, my evaluation don't really count unless I had an attendee. And I'm like, okay, I think for myself.
Right, there you go. But that goes back to what Tim was talking about. That coat is a symbol.
Right.
And there can be conflict from that. So yeah, so a lot of these preludes for conflict live within inside the individual. This whole idea about triggering events and knowing these triggering events, Doug said that means that your awareness of this or a command you develop around triggering events can be a very useful tool to defend yourself or to better manage yourself, but it can also be used as a tool for manipulation and control of others.
That's a skill, I would think, because I would say that for me, I'm quite a calm person, but I'm not always good in all situations with that. Like I don't have any tolerance for disrespect. Like my tolerance is very low with it. And so people like, when I experience that situation and I push back, they're like, wow, I didn't know that was you. Kind of like,
didn't know you had that in you.
Yeah, exactly.
You got triggered. You got triggered. And so I think that's a really interesting thing, though, again, because as we are, like Tim, in your situation, dealing with the board, is there some third party at this board who wants to stir up trouble between, other people on the board? Because they obviously would need to know, and they would need to somehow or another manipulate those triggers that those people have.
Yeah, no, but my quick view of it and the little insight that I have is that it's really personality conflict because the chair of the funding source board member is no longer on the board, and you can already sense a sigh of relief. And so clearly that individual was at the center of a lot of the conflict.
Interesting. Very interesting.
And T, I'd like to add too that I think a lot of the triggering is unconscious. It's kind of like Eric Burns' game that I'll act in a way to make you behave to justify how I feel. So if I'm judgmental or critical, I may act in a way to reinforce that belief.
Even though I might not have be doing it so overtly or deliberately,
right.
It's just be happening because it's part of the fiber of how I am and who I am. But yeah, I just think it's really interesting when you go, someone who really understands triggers and how to identify other people's triggers. Think of all the turmoil they can stir up if they have some agenda that they think that would help them achieve.
A very simple example comes to mind, and that would be reality shows.
Oh yeah.
They trigger other people on purpose.
Yeah, in fact, we were talking about that the producers choose people for reality shows more so for that because conflict is interesting to watch. And Lynn and I have been watching a very long-running cooking show in Australia called My Kitchen Rules. It's been on for, I think, a good 12 years or whatever. Very long season, some 40 episodes in a given season. So it's a really big involved kind of thing. Well, okay, this is a competition about food, and Linda and I sit there and like we're yelling at the TV. Not that we yell, but we're having an exchange with the TV. We're just kind of going like, it's a cooking show, vote based on the food. And they're going like, well, we need to vote strategically, and it's food, people, food. So it's interesting how they want these conflict between the players, between the houses, between the judges, on and on and on. And there's this one guy who is a professional poker player who also happens to cook. And for him, everything is strategy. Everything is about understanding his opponents and then pitting the opponents against one another. And so very much, I think that's what we're talking about, the dark side of these triggering events. Okay, so the next one talks about an initiation phase. I've had to really stop and think about this one. The initiation phase is actually the phase when the conflict has already begun. Okay, heated arguments, abuses, verbal disagreements are all warning alarms, which indicate that the fight is already on. So I guess my issue is with the word initiation, because obviously the trigger is what initiated it. And then I think there's this, I would rather call it like a reactive phase. So the trigger, and Brian can explain the neurochemistry that's involved in all this, but that trigger ended up very much escalating whatever someone was thinking or feeling or experiencing biochemically. And that's what, launched the argument or the abuse, the verbal disagreement. So to me, these aren't warning alarms that indicate the fight is already on. It's kind of like, what do you mean warning? The fight is already on. There's no warning involved. So there's no preview of what's to come. It's happening. So I don't think the initiation label feels right to me, but there you go. Thoughts about that?
I can't tell the difference, because to me, if like you said, for me, it starts on the physiological level, right? So like when you're triggered by something literally happens physiologically to your body. That's called a somatic nervous system.
Yep.
So the hypothalamus will kick in, you'll start breathing heavy, or you'll get heated, or something physiologically happens, and that becomes the trigger. So if they're saying for the initiation phase that this is my response to that trigger, it's kind of like I said before, when I get really angry, which is rare, it'll sound like I just came to America. Like something triggers in me to where my action just gets like really, really thick for some reason. I'm cussing out to my mind in my own language.
Yeah. No, actually the change grid can explain that. So anyone who does not have, well, let's talk about English or our version of English, our accent around English as their natural language, can only duplicate that whatever, that accent, that tone, that whatever, when they're in power.
Yeah.
So the further upgrid they go or the further downgrid they go, the less able they are to manage the effect of whatever their language was. Yep.
What if we call, instead of the initiation phase, what if we call it the activation phase?
That sound feels a lot better to me, because something triggered me to action. I think that's what it is. The trigger event, I mean, it triggered something.
Yeah.
And so that's why I just go like, this label initiation feels like, I don't know, like it kind of missed the boat. It's like, oh no, the initiation happened in the moment of triggering. If anything, the trigger was the initiator.
Mm-hmm. So
that's good. So if we ever find out where this model came from, we'll have to send them a note to just correct them. Yeah, so I like that idea. All right, so now we've got the thing that's going on, and now this, to me, this phase 3 is the explosive part of the whole thing. So this is the argument, this is the fight, that's what's happening. Now you move into the differentiation phase, and I don't know that I like that label either, but it's the phase when the individuals voice out their differences against each other. The reasons for the conflict are raised in the differentiation phase. Now, I have to tell you why I have a problem with that, and I'm open to anyone who wants to have an opposing viewpoint, so you just feel free to chime in, say whatever you want to say. But I think this is the phase where we're, as an outsider brought in, I need to facilitate, I need to help them find common ground. I don't need them to tell me what their differences are against the other person. I just need them to speak their own personal truth. and then allow the other party to speak whatever their personal truth is. So I don't need to question, attack in any way other people's thoughts and feelings or whatever. I need to speak my own. And as we talk about our individual perspectives, we're going to find out that a certain amount, hopefully, of those individual perspectives overlap, and we have some things in common. And so we aren't at polar opposites. We have some shared values or some shared beliefs or some shared facts or whatever it happens to be. So this differentiation phase seems like the intention of it is to get people to prove themselves to be as different as they can be. And I don't know how healthy that is. So maybe this is what happens in an unfacilitated conflict.
Right. I think that would build on the activation. I mean, it'll keep the triggering going, because you got to remember, we have mediation processes in the brain that helps us to already differentiate. And when that is met with differentiation, that triggers something, because now we're left with, well, how does this add up? So,
Right.
you know, we need a facilitator to help us reconcile that. So it seems like there's some reconciliation phase maybe, but not necessarily differentiation, because if you're just focusing on that, you're going to stay triggered.
Yeah. And so that's what I'm thinking, like here, this must be how conflict evolves in a, if it's not in any way, there's no intervention, there's no one's coming in to try to help the situation, that once that argument or whatever begins, it's going to become a, here's why you're wrong, kind of a thing, instead of me saying, let me just tell you what my truth is. You don't need to be wrong, or I don't need to prove that you're wrong in order to prove that I'm right. I don't need to do that. I just need to be able to present my case, and then you can present your case. And maybe I'm describing something healthier than what this is getting to. If this is saying this is where individuals just start attacking each other, and the reasons for the conflict, and this was my other thing that kind of triggered me about this, is that when I see the reasons for conflict are raised, I interpret that two ways. One of them is that people can have conflict about the content of the conflict. And the other is that rather than talking about the content of the conflict, they talk about how people are handling the conflict or how they're communicating. So how often have you had an argument with somebody and very quickly you realize we're not talking about the issue anymore, because they're saying, you always do this, you always say blah, blah, you never blah, blah, blah. It's kind of, what are we talking about, the issue? Or are we talking about how we go about handling issues historically? Because that's a totally different subject. So am I the only one, or have you guys experienced that same thing? Oh, they're all quiet. I guess it is just me.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely, T.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's the whole thing. So what are we talking about? And so that to me is is what that second line may very well lead to, is that they're no longer talking about the content of the actual conflict. Now they're just, you're always this and blah, 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 blah.
In
Yep.
real life, it seems like after the activation phase, people either resolve the conflict or they don't.
Interesting.
One party makes amends or changes their position, or they don't.
Yeah. Yeah.
This idea of further spiraling it, you know, in the differentiation phase and then finally to the resolution phase is seems a little.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because I thought, hey, if this is going to just naturally progress 1, 2, 3, 4, then I don't think 5 is likely to happen.
Right.
So a conflict leads to nowhere. Individuals must try to compromise to some extent. Well, where do they get that sudden piece of awareness if they've been in conflict? Is they're both going to just exhaust themselves? I mean, I do believe that at a certain point in time, people get argued out. You know, you just get exhausted, you know, physically, emotionally, intellectually exhausted. And then you go like, okay, we got him, you know, I can't deal with it anymore. Fine, what are we going to do? Or, you know, so is that their idea of a resolution phase? Because obviously in my role as a facilitator, consultant, or whatever, I want a very different differentiation phase, and I want a very different resolution phase than what these seem to indicate happen in a conflict, pursuing in an unrestricted way or an unrestrained way.
Well,
Yep, go
I
ahead.
was going to say, one of the things I'm thinking about, though, that might prevent that process from completing is if someone is avoiding,
Oh, yeah.
engagement.
Right.
And so if they're avoiding, then step 4 may not happen. I'm reading this book, Conflict Without Casualties, and the author talks about, the term he uses, openness, which is applicable to step 4 here.
Okay.
And he defines that as one being willing to state their desired feeling or goal. And so if I'm not willing to do that, I don't think we're going to make it to step 5, and we'll continue to have the conflict, and
That's
it may
right.
fester into something more.
Yep. And I would suggest that what you've just described is a very different step 4 than the one they've written here in these 2 sentences. Because in this one, it says it's the phase when the individuals voice out their differences against each other. So now it's like, it feels almost more like they're attacking each other and each other's intelligence, each other's whatever, as opposed to saying like, no, let me speak my truth. Let me share, I just want to communicate I want to build my case,
And that's interesting, because in that book, he's talking about how people will view conflict, in that if you view it as a negative thing, then you more than likely go in that direction. But that if it's something that you embrace as a positive, as something that could create something beneficial for the organization or for the individual in that conflict, then you might see it differently.
That's right. And that gets back to what we're saying here, that conflict is a prerequisite for change to occur. That's a healthy mindset around change, or rather around both conflict and change for that matter. So I think you're absolutely right. So without labeling it too harshly, this feels like what happens in conflict, like the natural phases, as opposed to any intervention.
This looks academic.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd like to add too that Lencioni, in his 5 behaviors of a cohesive team, 5 dysfunctions, he says that every team needs to have conflict. If you have enough trust, you can be real with each other.
There you are. And so, and I think that's the whole point, is that healthy conflict is a very positive thing and should not be avoided or feared or anything like that, because there's some ground rules that go around it that are either explicit or implied that makes it all perfectly healthy. What they're describing here does not feel like it's going to go in a healthy direction as they describe 4 and 5.
I think the challenge for me, the big part is that David hit on the academic side of things, is so many of these from like step 1 through 4, they're unconscious. Like there's so much of that you don't even realize until you're in it. So there's not really much you're controlling at that point.
Yep. And I've always thought that someone's reactions to conflict are far more primal than, as an intelligent species, we might want to acknowledge. There is a threat perceived. There is a survival instinct that comes into play. And now you add to that personality, and you add to that, in most boardrooms, a whole lot of testosterone. And who knows what it's going to escalate into. So, I mean, this conflict, if we apply it out to, areas of life where it occurs, this could end up in war.
Yeah. Can I build on that for a second?
Please do.
When you think about any autocrat, the playbook is demonize your enemies, make people afraid of them, and then say, I'll keep you safe from them, and then smear anybody who doesn't agree as unpatriotic or crazy.
There you go. Yep.
So
yep.
conflict is a great tool if you want to be an autocrat.
Absolutely. It's a very powerful tool for manipulation, but that means you have to have a very strong command of what these triggers are. And you can even get all the way down to vocabulary that certain words are symbolic, going to Tim's point, are symbolic. They represent things that some people are going to feel very positively about, and others are going to feel very negatively about. And on and on. And obviously we could start throwing out a whole bunch of those, but that would change the topic for for the day. So anyway, as we've worked our way through this, I do kind of feel like what I'm looking at here from a science perspective is these are the observable phases of conflict. So if I'm an outsider and I'm just watching people in conflict, I would not be in any way hesitant to say, I wouldn't be surprised to see these things unfold as they are listed here as an observer. But if I'm someone who wants to intervene or help, whatever label you want to give it, I need to interrupt these phases at least between 3 and 4. Maybe I could do something between 2 and 3. Maybe I could even do something around number 2. And in a perfect situation, I can help people recognize that all these differences don't necessarily have to lead to conflict. They could lead to celebration.
That's what makes us development professionals.
That's right.
We try to, enter into the equation pre-number 1.
Right. Or, if we're coaches or consultants get brought in the last minute, we join them wherever they are and just try to move them backwards. Can we just scoot you back one step? Can we just go back one step? And hopefully, I don't know if we're going to fix everything that fast, but at least we can create more levels of awareness, etc. Okay. Now, yeah, I want to show you a change grid for just a second. There's a lot of things in the change grid that I want to explore, but I want to start with this whole idea about this resolution phase as they've described it. A conflict leads to nowhere. Individuals must try to compromise to some extent and resolve the conflict soon. The resolution phase explores the various options to resolve the conflict. I don't see how those 3 sentences go together. I think those are 3 very separate thoughts that, may or may not be happening and whatever. Because I don't think these people, unless someone intervenes, I don't think these people are likely to explore various options to resolve the conflict. I think they're going to I think, Peter, did you say someone's just going to, what word did you use? Not acquiesce. What was your word?
Oh, boy.
It was an A word. Yeah, they're going. Yeah.
Oh, boy. Well, I had another thought just a moment. I'll think of that.
Okay.
But, when it comes to perceptions, once you're in that phase and you judge somebody, they're very tenacious. And Einstein himself said it's easier to smash an atom than change your perception.
There you go. There you go. Well, so that's where we get a little bit onto the change grid. We'll get into in great detail next time around. But this idea about conflict and depending on where the 2 players are, or just talking about it energetically based on this thought that somehow or another there's going to be a resolution phase. Well, I would say to you that 2 of these danger zones are very likely to keep the argument going, and 2 are very likely to just withdraw, throw up both hands, give up, whatever. So who are my people that are going to continue the fight and who are going to just
Upgrade and outgrid?
Yeah.
Upgrade and outgrid are going to continue the fight. And the downgrade, like, what do you think? If we got a downgrid person that's in conflict with an upgrid person, how do you think that one's going to settle out when everyone's, exhausted?
I would say submissive hostility.
Yeah, right. It's going to be they're just going to go like, give up. They're a fool. I'm not even going to bother anymore. Sooner or later, they'll self-destruct. That downgrid kind of languaging, and the upgrid person still going to be highly reactive because look, they have a very different perception of whatever that situation happens to be. The more of a bully the outgrid person becomes, what do you think happens to downgrid and ingrid people?
Just fade away.
they fade away. Or I love probably what the downgrade person does, because their perceived levelability is so high, as they go, that fool is wrong. And sooner or later, they're going to find out how wrong they really are. And on that day, I'm going to be proven right. You know, so I can kind of hear that I told you so, or I knew this was going to happen. That kind of languaging might go along, but they're just going to go like, oh no, let them go ahead and self-destruct. This will be amusing at the very least.
And
No,
T, I think that that's dangerous for the organization, because that can damage folks emotionally, which would distract them from contributing their talent to the business.
You are
Amen.
absolutely right. Absolutely right.
And another observation too, I know of one individual who was in that really outgrid in the danger zone, high ability, and 12 and 12, and that person would never ever change. And I
Never.
think that would mean that the conflict wouldn't change, right?
Right. And it's never going. So people either have to go along with it, operate within it, or gather their goodies and go. And so that's, we talked about, when we talked about dysfunction on the change grid, we said that once people realize that they are in the midst of a dysfunctional psychodrama, their choice is to either become one of the role players in their psychodrama, in that psychodrama. They have to adopt whatever the role is, or they have to leave the theater. They have to get out altogether. So that's part of the issue out here. Talk about drama being created. You know, drama is outgrid and upgrid. So, and by the way, I would say to you that drama itself is probably more upgrid if I was thinking about literary works, because the outgrid people tend to be the masterminds of whatever it is. So I think like movies where the criminals end up becoming the stars. So is that like Ocean's, whatever number you want? You know, they're all robbers, but boy, are they calculated. Nothing's really going to stop them. And for some reason, we really appreciate that storyline. Yeah.
But see, doesn't this also at least support the value of emotional intelligence? You know, we had that conversation previously.
Yeah. And so again, if emotional intelligence lives in these 4 sub-quadrants, none of these 4 quadrants is in a danger zone. And so if anything, we'd say, well, where on the change grid does healthy conflict resolution happen? And I would say it's where we find emotional intelligence. It certainly is going to happen downgrade, because again, the downgrade people tend to just, they're quiet, they're masters of the subject. And so they're not going to be in there actively, cooperatively. One of the things we're going to be looking at is the relationship between the 2 dimensions were cooperation and competition. I should have slid that into the
Was
slide
it
deck.
collaboration?
Yeah, it's this one.
Yeah.
So collaboration versus level of competitiveness. And that ends up plotting us on there. So we'll be looking at that one, you know, next time we're together as well. So, but I think that a great deal of conflict, or dare I say, I believe conflict, period, can be explained on the change grid. So, and again, before we think, oh, it's because people are in different places, I promise you 2 people in the outgrid danger zone can be very much in conflict with one another. Can you guys relate to that? I mean, they're playing, this is the ultimate competition. So
Perception is always, you know, a conglomerate of like our beliefs and values. And so, you know, 2 people can read the same book and have a different outcome of what they just read.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, in fact, one quick thing that will be done, Linda's still on the call. So I had never seen movies like Camelot. I had never seen movies like Gone with the Wind. I just never saw them until I met Linda. And I had a very different perspective on a lot of them. So I think it was Camelot. And Linda, you can unmute and share your story. But Linda thought Camelot was like one of the greatest stories ever told, so romantic and blah, blah, blah. Do you want to tell them what I said about it?
That's when I was a teenager.
I know.
And as I grew up, and I've seen it 10 times now because I love the movie, I realized it was really about adultery.
It's a movie that celebrates adultery.
But I still love the movie, so.
Yeah. So it's like, talk about perspectives. Oh, this is such a romantic thing. Really? It's like, I saw a very different.
Not for King Arthur, it wasn't.
Yeah, well, there you go. Right. Okay, well, there you go. So when we get back together on Tuesday, we'll talk about locations on the change grid, where conflict will most naturally be found, where harmony most naturally will be found, and then we can look about where people are plotting and how they behave and how does that really affect conflict, and then ultimately what do we do to resolve it? How do we help prevent it? Okay, so with that, thanks everybody. We'll chat again next week. So have a great weekend. Bye for now.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye all.
Guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.